So welcome to tonight's discussion, What is the Future of ANZAC Day? Brought to you by Melbourne Conversations and Knowledge Melbourne, both City of Melbourne initiatives. This event is supported by our long-standing venue partner Federation Square and future leaders and their director Dr. Helen Sykes. My name is Claire Wright and I'm your host and moderator this evening. I'm an historian based at La Trobe University. I'm an associate professor in history there, amongst other things that I do with my time. My latest book is on the forgotten rebels of Eureka. But so here we are tonight, here to start a conversation that I hope will continue to resonate, reverberate, intensify and escalate well beyond the confines of this glassy room on this chilly evening in April 2015. As an historian, I'm used to starting with the ending. Something has happened and you look back in time to figure out how it happened, when it did, who was involved in it and why it mattered. But tonight my gaze is fixed firmly on a story that has yet to unfold. I've asked these four remarkable thinkers and interpreters to look into their crystal balls and to divine for us what they see as the future of ANZAC Day. Now, this might seem to be a bit of an arse-about way to commemorate the anniversary of an event that occurred 100 years ago. And yet such is the centrality of the ANZAC story to our historical consciousness and contemporary national life that I feel fairly confident in predicting that we will still be marking these anniversaries in 2040 and 2065. I remember well attending the launch of the Victorian Government's program of events here in this hall, a program of events to celebrate the sesquicentenary of the Eureka Stockade. That was in 2004. The political rhetoric was flowing in language and tones that the Eureka rebels would have been gobsmacked to hear in 1854. The then Premier Steve Bracks sung the praises of virtues such as diversity and dissent. Now, the rebels themselves didn't dare rehash the events of that bloody Sunday morning of 3rd of December for another 30 years, and even when they did, they certainly were not talking about it in those terms. So, the ANZAC Day we will witness this Saturday, with its pilgrimages to Gallipoli, packed out dawn services around the nation, commercialised and corporatised shopping cart of heroes, freedom fighters and all-round good Aussie blokes, its $1 million publicity-funded budget of memorials and exhibitions, its saturation media coverage, so that ANZAC Day is not always the way it's been. The 25th of April was gazetted as a public holiday in 1927. ANZAC Day was observed then with quiet dignity and restraint, save for the traditional indulgence in drinking and gambling. By the 1960s, the ANZAC legend was in decline. In the 1970s, opposition to the Vietnam War morphed into the general antipathy towards any military and imperialist commemoration, and ANZAC Day became a lightning rod for other protest movements too, such as feminism, multiculturalism and republicanism. The combined wall of generational apathy and hostility was not surmounted until the 1980s, when a new interest in, and indeed passion for, a shared history rooted around the memory of the ANZAC's heroic sacrifice began to emerge. And it appears that we are still caught in the slipstream of that yearning. But if the ANZAC spirit is a social construction and ANZAC Day is not an unassailable, immutable Saints' Day in our national calendar, then where to from here? So in kick-starting this conversation, I have given our panellists a deliberately broad brief. I've asked them, with crystal balls in hand, to offer us a meditation, a prediction, a manifesto, a prognosis, an ambition, perhaps a fantasy. And I know that at the very least they'll give us something to think about. Carolyn Holbrook, as our token academic on the panel tonight, we're going to kick off with you. Dr. Carolyn Holbrook is a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University. Carolyn's PhD was entitled The History of the Great War in the Australian Imagination since 1915, and that has recently been published to much critical acclaim as ANZAC, the Unauthorised Biography. Carolyn is currently working with Professor James Walter on a project that examines the history of Australian policy making, and that project compares case studies from the 1940s, the 1980s, and the current period in order to determine how policy making has changed. Carolyn has previously worked as a food and wine journalist and as a policy advisor in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and I'm not sure which one sounds like more fun. Carolyn.
So, how will Australians remember ANZAC in 50 years' time, or in 100 years' time? That's a question that can only be answered, I think, if we understand the forces that propel ANZAC commemoration today, the forces that give ANZAC its extraordinary potency in contemporary Australian society. Now, being an historian, a token academic, I would like to begin by providing a little bit of background. I just want to take a moment to describe how we observed ANZAC Day 50 years ago in 1965. So the dawn service at the Australian War Memorial on the 50th anniversary of the Gallipoli landing attracted a record crowd. The Canberra Times reported the following day that 1,500 people turned out, despite the chill wind and leaden sky. Now, to put that number, 1,500, in context, Brendan Nelson, the director of the Australian War Memorial, expects that 50,000 people will attend the dawn service in Canberra this coming Saturday. In 1965, a group of old diggers travelled to Gallipoli for the 50th anniversary. The elderly men were pleasantly surprised when 4 young Australian hitchhikers, 2 women and 2 men in jeans and parkas, turned up on the peninsula for the occasion. Now, to put that number in context, 42,000 Australians applied for permission to attend Gallipoli this coming Saturday. The government capped the attendance at 10,000. In the words of the historian Ken Inglis, the 4 hitchhikers of 1965 were, quote, welcomed by the old men as unexpected evidence that some young Australians cared about the ANZAC tradition. The trip to Gallipoli was organised by the RSL. Unlike these days, the government played no role. It did not contribute money, nor did politicians travel to Turkey with the old diggers. In fact, Prime Minister Robert Menzies spent the day in Canberra. He attended the opening of a newly constructed road called ANZAC Parade that ran between the recently filled Lake Burley Griffin and the War Memorial. The road was opened by the Duke of Gloucester. Menzies seems to have been more energised by the presence in Australia of British royalty than by the ANZAC Jubilee. So as you can see, on the occasion of its 50th anniversary in the mid-60s, as Claire has already alluded to, ANZAC did not enjoy the popularity that it has today. Indeed, it was widely perceived to be in terminal decline. Most commentators predicted that ANZAC Day would die out along with the last of the old diggers. So Australians of 50 years ago would be astonished about the way that we are commemorating ANZAC Day in 2015. Australia is the most prolific commemorator of the Great War in the entire world. We are spending upwards of $400 million on the Great War centenary. By way of comparison, the governments of Britain and France are each spending about $90 million. Germany is spending just $7 million, New Zealand $16 million, and Canada absolutely nothing. So Australia, a minor player in the Great War, is spending more than all these countries combined. So now that I've given you some flavour of the 50th anniversary and the 100th anniversary, which you're here to witness yourselves, how might we commemorate ANZAC in 50 years' time? Well, the first thing I would say is that this topic is a moving feast. What I'm saying tonight about the future of ANZAC is different from what I planned to say a week ago, before Woolworths tried to sink its snout into the ANZAC trough. Now, I presume all of you have heard about the furore created last week when Woolworths launched a First World War commemoration campaign with the tagline, "Fresh in Our Memories." The backlash, not only against Woolworths, but against ANZAC commercialisation in general, has been fierce. Marketing strategies have been falling like dominoes. A shamefaced Woolworths cancelled its campaign last Tuesday night. A few days later, Target, which is producing merchandise for the Camp Gallipoli event, withdrew its ANZAC hoodie, ANZAC beanie and ANZAC beer stubby from sale under instruction from the Minister for Veterans Affairs, Michael Ronaldson. The Age published a withering editorial on Saturday about the VB Razor Glass advertising campaign, which deftly positions its brand of beer in the glow of the ANZAC legend. So nervous businesses are left wondering whether they have overestimated the public appetite for ANZAC. Last week, the country singer Lee Kernaghan was forced to cancel his ANZAC Arena Spectacular Tour due to poor ticket sales. And Channel 9 has reportedly reneged on its plan to send Karl Stefanovic to Gallipoli to report on centenary commemorations. The critically lauded Gallipoli television series on Channel 9 rated poorly, as did Channel 7's show about the Victoria Cross with Ben Roberts-Smith. So before all these events, I envisaged ANZAC Day in 50 years' time as an extension of what we are seeing in 2015. I judged that ANZAC's popularity with the Australian public would provide the motivation for its continued commercialisation. I believe that this commercialisation was being poorly policed by a government that arguably had more to gain from the growth of ANZACery than its containment. But I think the Woolworths incident offers hope of something different. I think a line in the sand has been drawn. I am more hopeful now that we can rein in the rank commercial exploitation of the Great War. I'm also hopeful that we can expose the tendency of politicians to use the ANZAC legend to their own ends. I can foresee a commemoration in 50 years' time that is more muted and respectful, less encumbered by commercial kitsch and political exuberance, and more devoted to recalling the tragedy and the suffering of war. However, as some astute commentators have observed, the backlash against the commercialisation of ANZAC raises questions of its own. Christians have watched in dismay as Easter and Christmas have been drained of their original moral purpose and been thoroughly commercialised. Presumably, the withering of these Christian festivals has occurred because people no longer care enough to resist. While Woolworths is pilloried for fresh in our memories, we merely sigh in resignation when Easter buns appear in the supermarkets in late January and Christmas decorations in October. So what are people protecting when they object so vehemently to the commercialisation of ANZAC? I hope that our willingness to defend ANZAC does not come from its elevation as some kind of secular religion. I worry that this is happening when I hear the diggers spoken about in the reverential language of suffering and sacrifice. In yesterday's Age, the Professor of Theology, Bruce Stevens, coined the term digger spirituality to describe the increasingly religious character of ANZAC commemoration. So I hope by 2065 that we have resisted the commercialisation of ANZAC, not because we have idealised the men who fought in the Great War for our own purposes, but because we deem it vulgar and immoral to gain commercial advantage from their unspeakable suffering. I hope that we have dispatched to history the rhetoric that says the Australian nation was born at Gallipoli, not because we are hostile to the ANZACs or to war commemoration itself, but because we recognise that values such as mateship and egalitarianism were not invented in 1915. I hope that we have more pride and self-regard than to believe that distinctively Australian trays only existed because other nations were there to observe them. I hope in 2065 that we have rid ourselves of our ANZAC myopia and connected Gallipoli to the broader sweep of Australian history. I would like the so-called ANZAC spirit to be remembered as one element within a long history of egalitarianism, mateship and courage, so that a legend based on war is no longer our most potent symbol of national unity. I hope that we have come to understand by 2065 that if we seek to make money from ANZAC's suffering or exploit their experience for political gain, we dishonour their memory. And finally, I hope the Australians of 2065 understand that the greatest honour we can do the men of 1915 is to remember how dreadful their experience was in order that it not be repeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's a great way to start, and you've given us a lot to think about. Now, our next speaker has been a political journalist and a foreign correspondent with the ABC since 1987. If you don't know Michael Brittenden's face, you will certainly know his voice. My husband and I enjoy our tea and toast in bed to the dulcet tones of Michael's voice every morning at the moment. He is currently the presenter of AM's Current Affairs program on ABC Radio, and it's one of the ABC's most important agenda-setting programs. Michael began his career covering federal politics for the ABC's radio current affairs programs AM and PM, so he's come a full circle. In 1994, Michael was appointed as ABC's Moscow correspondent and subsequently was posted to Brussels as the ABC's European correspondent. Michael covered many of the biggest international stories of the 1990s and early 2000s from all corners of the globe, from the Pacific to Europe, the US and the Middle East, including the various Balkan wars, the conflict in Chechnya, the fall of Suharto in Indonesia, and the build-up to the Iraq War. On September the 1st, 2001, Michael was sent to New York to report on the devastating impact of the attacks on the World Trade Center. He returned to Australia and to political reporting in 2003 and was the political editor for the 7:30 report in Canberra for 6 years. In July 2009, Michael moved to Washington to be the ABC's TV current affairs correspondent in the United States, and he returned back to Australia in early 2013 to take up the role as the network's defence and national security correspondent, where he became fully appraised of the issues surrounding ANZAC centenaries. Michael has won 2 Walkley Awards, the most recent being just last year, and we're very, very privileged to have Michael here on the panel tonight.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Claire. I do feel surrounded by such eminent brains and historians, slightly out of my depth, so, but anyway. And there was an awful lot of hope in Carolyn's address, and I'm not sure I share all of that. We can hope, but I fear that 50 years is not long enough. As we know, ANZAC Day has come to mean something quite different than over the years, and to be enriched with so much more meaning than it had. Not all of it good, but not all of it bad. The thing is, ANZAC Day will continue to change, and when asked to consider how the 25th of April will appear in 50 years' time to the babies born today, let's say Sandor and Carlisi, just to take 2 of what I'm told are the more popular names of expectant parents at the moment, it's perhaps useful to recast what it's meant for me and how it's changed in my lifetime, because of course we all have an ANZAC history. I grew up in the shadow of the War Memorial in Canberra, and believe me, there weren't many other buildings of note in Canberra in the 1960s. But for most of my childhood, Anzac Day was simply the day we decided to turn the heating on. I never went to a dawn service, and that wasn't unusual. Back then, Anzac Day was marked not often by the 1500 that turned out in 1965, but certainly a bit later on, the crowds really did fall away. And I remember one year, I think the Canberra Times reported about 15 people turned up, and they gathered under the dome. Now, of course, the ceremony draws thousands, and yes, we'll probably have about 50,000 this year. Anzac Day was also the day my father would be called in to drag his best mate, a World War II fighter pilot, out of the Royal Hotel in Queanbeyan, where he would inevitably end up. It's one of my earliest memories, sitting in the car outside the Royal, my dad looking for his mate, the famous poet and grazier David Campbell, as other drunk veterans from all walks of Australian life literally fell out of the pub. Anzac Day was a great leveller. It made a big impression on me, but I don't recall David Campbell ever going on an Anzac Day march. And as far as I recall, my grandfather, who fought in the First World War, never went to an Anzac Day march either, although he did write extensively about his war experience for the RSL magazine Reveille. W.C. Groves fought with the 14th Australian Infantry Battalion alongside Gallipoli hands, men, as he said, whose vivid and poignant memories of the slaughter and heroism of the Peninsular days had been deepened by their even more nerve-wracking experience on the Western Front. His cobbers, Snowy Haynes, Old Jimmy Gunn, Sergeant Major Les Guppy, or as he says, dear old Les with the melancholy moustache and the laughing eye, and Clary Dulwitz, a fine fellow but a rotten interpreter, and Ginty Stewart of Terang. William Groves was taken prisoner by the Germans at Bullecourt, and he was 17 years old. He went on to serve in New Guinea as well in the Second World War, so war and the Australian war experience defined much of his life. I do wonder what he'd make of the present-day pilgrimages made by young Jason and Corey and Kylene and Jessica. Would he recognise their motivation? Would he marvel at what it's become, or would he shudder? Well, we'll never know, which is perhaps the point. The change really began, I began to notice the change as obviously as all the people with direct memories began to die off. And politicians who saw an opportunity to build a particular version of Australian history, to build an Australian patriotism around an event that, as Paul Keating describes it, reinforced through bravery and sacrifice our own cultural notions of independence, mateship and ingenuity. Well, maybe for the politicians, and no doubt for some historians, but I know one thing, W.C. Groves, my grandfather, wouldn't have seen it that way. He was an empire man through and through. He wasn't fighting under the Australian flag, he was fighting under the British ensign for king and empire. As a young political reporter, I saw the transformation of Anzac Day engineered by the political class firsthand. It was Bob Hawke who jumped on it first, as far as I recall. On the 75th anniversary, he took a small group of surviving veterans back to Anzac Cove. But the intensity of the day and the commemorative importance to the nation seemed to grow from there as the old diggers passed away. And under John Howard, the crowds began to grow considerably, and Kontiki tours put it on the gap year itinerary. They say a lot of things about politicians, many of them unfair, some of them not. Never stand in front of a state premier and a bucket of federal money is one, which certainly has some resonance of the last week or so. But to that we can certainly now add never stand between a politician and an opportunity to use Anzac Day to wrap themselves in the flag and the khaki. Who could forget Kevin Rudd and Channel 7's clumsy efforts to co-opt the Anzac Day ceremony at Long Tan and bring the dawn service forward an hour so it could fit into Sunrise's peak morning ratings period? So that's all a rather long way to get to this point. How will Anzac Day look in 50 years? If the last 25 years or 50 years or anything to go by, it'll be even more central to the national psyche and even more manipulated than ever. Prime Minister Khaleesi Williams, the great-great-granddaughter of Private Cecil Bluey Williams, who served at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, will open the ANZAC 150th Anniversary Commemorative Pavilion. She'll urge young Australian travellers to enjoy the full sensory experience, to throw themselves, digitally speaking, over the trenches and experience the bravery and sacrifice that forged the Australian nation firsthand. The address will be watched live by many of Australia's 83 million inhabitants, who will pass judgment on it instantly and continuously. At Anzac Cove, while the speech is still underway, Ms Williams' party minders will monitor the feedback and be ennobled by the overwhelming positive response from a population hungrier than ever for meaning. Some of those watching and commemorating will be doing so in the old Royal Hotel site at Queanbeyan, which has by 2065 become an Apple Experience Centre. It still sells alcoholic drinks, but the building itself detects when someone has had too much and refuses to sell them anymore. Many will be there simply to get some respite from the heat. It's still hot by the end of April. The days when Anzac Day heralded the first frosts on the Monero Plains are now a distant memory. The veterans, if there are any, will be armchair veterans, technical engineers and designers of unmanned machines of death. Wars are now fought mostly by urban guerrillas aligned to various factions and warlords rather than nation states, but infrastructure and resources are still constantly monitored, protected and policed by drones, and we are particularly good at that. But one thing has remained constant. Despite the many campaigns to have it replaced, the Australian flag hasn't changed at all. And it is still the cape of choice for the crowds of young Australians who've caught the bullet train from Istanbul to be there for the dawn service. Thank you.
I'm going to go straight on to our next speaker. We're going to draw some of these things together in the end. Celeste Liddle. On her blog, Rantings of an Aboriginal Feminist, Celeste describes herself as an Arunto feminist, anarchist-leaning trade unionist with a taste for proto-punk. So I think it's fair to say that she is the very antithesis of today's homogenised image of an ANZAC. When she's not ranting, Celeste is the National Indigenous Organiser for the National Tertiary Education Union. Her articles and social commentary have been published in The Guardian, Daily Life, Tracker and Crikey, and if there's a protest meeting out the front of Flinders Street Station, you'll be likely to see Celeste there. Celeste.
Before I started, I just wanted to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also identify myself as a proud Arundel woman from Central Australia. In 2014, the theme for the National NAIDOC Week was Serving Country, Centenary and Beyond, deliberately worded by the community to highlight not only the many unrecognised Indigenous soldiers who have served in every conflict Australia has been involved in, but also the defending of our traditional lands within the frontier wars and beyond. It proved a good opportunity for a number of community members to tell stories of their ancestors who had served, as well as highlighting stories of our resistance warriors and actions taken by many in the face of an invading colonial force in the defence of our traditional lands. Yet despite this opportunity to explore these issues on a national scale, the theme didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just because I've been a frequent anti-war protester who resents the culture wars during the Howard years and the staunch jingoism that I feel was ushered in, which was also heavy on the flag wearing but light on historical fact. It was more complicated than that. I feel therefore that I can't look forward without looking back. It wasn't until a good friend of mine appeared at my office door and told me the story of the howling, hideous old hag that some of the issues I was feeling began to fall into place. My friend had been listening to a radio broadcast one day, and a commentator was talking about the exploration journals of Colonel Peter Edgerton Warburton, in particular his journey from Alice Springs to the Oakover River in WA in 1873. To paint the scene, the team had been travelling across one of the harshest desert regions in the world. Along the way, they had encountered quite a few Aboriginal camps and had, in fact, taken to abducting some Aboriginal people in the hope that they could assist the company in finding water supplies. Just a couple of days earlier, before I start this little section I'm going to read, they had taken a young Aboriginal woman for this purpose, yet during the night she had succeeded in escaping by gnawing through the hair ropes which bound her. 4 days later, they succeeded in capturing a second woman, and this is from the journal entry on the 4th of September 1873. Marched 6 miles west, found a native camp and a well. Could not catch a native there, they being too quick for us. Not far, however, from the camp, a howling, hideous old hag was captured, and warned by the former escape, we secured this old witch by tying her thumbs behind her back and haltering her by the neck to a tree. She kept up a frightful howling all night, during which time we had to watch her by turns, or she would have gotten away also. I doubt whether there is any way of securing these creatures if you take your eyes off them for 10 minutes. The entry continues on the 5th of the 9th with, made 18 miles westing over bad country and no water. And then the final little section was on the 6th of September, where it states, we let the old witch go. She was one of the most alarming specimens of a woman I had ever saw. She had been of no use to us, and her sex alone saved her from punishment, for under the pretence of leading us to some native wells, she took us backwards and forwards over heavy sandhills, exhausting the camels as well as my small stock of patience. The well we found was in the opposite direction to the one she was taking us to. There were several reasons why I've been utterly fascinated with this passage ever since, and I think I've read it out about 10 times now. But yeah, I would also like to apologise that through the course of Chinese Whispers of this passage getting to me, I've forgotten the name of the original person who brought it to broadcast. But obviously the language used within the journal entry and the attitudes exhibited by Warburton and his crew regarding this woman were grating and despicable. We could frame those attitudes as being representative of the time bracket they occurred, but truth be told, these are attitudes that are not as distantly behind us as we would like to believe in this country. What is truly fascinating to me, though, is how Warburton interpreted this woman in her actions and how they are in direct conflict to how I'd read them. So if I was to cast my own lens over the passage that I've just read, I'd probably interpret it like this. Aboriginal woman is kidnapped by a bunch of explorers who, despite having an Aboriginal tracker in their company from another region, had a history of kidnap and abuse of the local people they encountered. The woman, once tethered to a tree, housed throughout the night to ensure that any surrounding family groups are warned of the presence of this party and keep well away for their own safety. She then leads them several miles over harsh terrain and deliberately away from any native wells, not only with the hope of inducing severe dehydration and possible death within the party, but also ensuring that they are kept well away from clan groups who are most likely to be near the water wells. The woman outlasts and manages to nearly kill 2 camels, despite these being creatures that store waters for purposes of surviving harsh conditions. So through a different lens, it's possible that this howling, hideous old hag could have actually been a cunning resistance warrior, taking actions to push back against the expanding frontier and protecting her kin. It's unlikely we'll ever have proof without the oral history of her descendants coming forward and stating this was the case. But I think on hearing this story, it suddenly dawned on me why the National NAIDOC theme was not sitting well with me last year. War and the commemoration of those who served is intrinsically linked to the centralising of white masculine narratives. Within Aboriginal narratives, by adopting narratives of served our country and fought side by side, we actually run the risk of buying into the same narratives that mainstream Australia has, in ways which, from our own historical perspective, we cannot afford to do. We run the risk of not only erasing the stories of our women and the trials and tribulations they faced during the frontier wars, but also erasing our proud history of resistance and anti-war actions. Feminist protests on ANZAC Day have highlighted the plight of women as victims of war, focusing in particular the horrors of war, rape, I remember seeing these protests as a kid growing up in, sometimes seeing them growing up in Canberra. Aboriginal protests have also been a fairly constant thing during ANZAC Day, and were used to highlight not only the unique experiences of our soldiers who served, but also to try and draw attention to the frontier wars and call for their recognition. Indeed, every single year there's usually some article that states that there's concerns Aboriginal protesters will interrupt the dawn service. Certainly our unique tales of engagement has been lost. The white masculine narrative is so entrenched that a lot of people don't actually realise that Aboriginal people have served in all conflicts Australia has been involved in, and indeed it is estimated that 1,000 Aboriginal men served in World War I. Additionally, while some might know that Aboriginal servicemen and women have been there from the beginning, it's not part of the Australian consciousness that on return from service, many Aboriginal people were excluded from the same benefits that other returned service people and their families could access. They're also ineligible for war pensions. They're excluded from most RSL clubs. Gaining forms of citizenship separated them from family members still living on missions, and they were denied soldier settlements. And indeed, just down the road in Healesville on the Coranderrk mission, returned servicemen, when the Coranderrk mission was turned into soldier settlements, returned Aboriginal servicemen weren't able to access them. That Aboriginal people served our country when we weren't actually a part of the country needs to form part of the history taught to people as they go through the education system. That 50 Aboriginal men were thought to have been left behind after the Boer War is another story that needs to be told about how people were excluded from returning if they did actually go. Our ancestors had no allegiance to the Empire. We were still engaged in frontier battles as world wars broke out, and indeed, considering the proposed forced closure of Aboriginal communities in WA, it's possible to argue that we are still engaged in frontier battles. Therefore, the concept of spirit of the Anzacs is not really one with which many Aboriginal people identify. My grandfather was a returned serviceman. He's having served in World War II, firstly in Darwin with his brothers and then in Borneo. For a short time, he achieved the rank of sergeant. My grandfather actually has a shrine dedicated to him in the Alice Springs RSL, and at a time when many Aboriginal people were refused entry, he could access it and was an active contributor. Last year, many of my family members were called upon by the media to give interviews about my grandfather's time, as certainly he was one of the more decorated Aboriginal servicemen from Alice Springs. It was known that he was very proud to serve, and that him and his brothers did actually join up because they wanted to defend their country against possible invasion. Yet at the same time, I began wondering when my family were talking about this, about my grandmother and where she was at the time and how she coped. Nana was, after all, a stolen generation woman who had only been schooled in domestic servitude and who, as an Aboriginal woman, was unable to access the support services for families of servicemen. At this stage, she already had several small children who needed to be supported. So how exactly did she, as someone who had no rights at all, manage to survive while my grandfather was away at war? It was through my brother's digging of family history that I managed to find out that this time Nana camped out at Whitegate with other extended family members, destitute but supporting each other. Coincidentally, at the same time my brother passed this information on, the exact same community, Whitegate, all of a sudden had its water turned off by the Northern Territory government as they were trying to force people to move on. I wonder how many other Aboriginal women survived at this time, and feel that when it comes to exploring the stories of Aboriginal people who served, these female narratives can't be ignored because they provide important historical context for us. I also don't necessarily see how the struggle that my grandfather went through was that much more important than what my grandmother was going through at the same time. Finally, when it came to the NAIDOC theme of last year, there was one more thing that bothered me. Aboriginal people have a strong and proud history of anti-war protest, and these too need to be remembered. One of the most prominent examples of this was the petition delivered to the German consulate in Melbourne in 1938 by Yorta Yorta leader William Cooper and a delegation of Aboriginal Advancement League people following Kristallnacht. This action of solidarity has been recognised by Jewish populations worldwide and has indeed led to memorials in Cooper's honour, such as the planting of 5 trees in the Forest of Martyrs. Additionally, many of our 1970s Aboriginal activists were involved in the anti-war rallies and cut their teeth by challenging fellow protesters on the concept of invasion, encouraging them to support land rights for Aborigines. As Aboriginal people, we need to remember that these instances where we have stood strongly and proudly against international conflict and asserted our own sovereignty. Unfortunately, I think that over the years, the importance of protest gets diminished, and while it is important to remember the many instances where mainstream Australia showed opposition to war, for example, the defeat of referendums on conscription or the massive anti-Iraq involvement in protests in 2003, it becomes even more important for Aboriginal people to highlight our resistance measures. So if I were to highlight where I hope we will be in 50 and 100 years' time when it comes to the commemoration of ANZAC Day, and these are hopes, I should say, I would say the following. Firstly, that this post-Howardism jingoistic narrative with regards to our participation as a nation in war has severely been diminished, and the day is remembered as the respectful and commemorative event it is. We're actually talking about great loss of mainly young people, and there have been additionally many who have taken stance against further loss, both of our own and of people overseas. Those who fell in service need to be remembered properly in their entirety and inclusively. Number 2, that the frontier wars in all their complexity are recognised, and we are a country which, while not comfortable with this knowledge, are actually educated and accepting of it. It is a disgrace that in 2015 most Victorians are not aware that this state was home to some of the most horrific massacres in the history of the country. We are a poorer nation for avoiding these stories, and as a result we continue to repeat history, albeit in more political and intellectual rather than physical ways. And 3, that the narratives of women, both black and white, are recognised within all of this, from the frontier wars to World War II comfort women all the way through to today. Men are not and have never been the only casualties of war. Without the acknowledgement of the frontier wars, we lose our history. Without acknowledgement of women's stories within the context of war, we lose our humanity. Thank you.
My goodness, Celeste, you've given us so much to think about. So much. I'm going to move straight on to our last speaker, James Brown. James is not a black soul singer. He is the author of ANZAC's Long Shadow, The Cost of Our National Obsession, which made a huge splash when it was released in time for ANZAC Day last year. Professor of Politics Judy Brett called James's book the most interesting and original book I have read on contemporary Australian public policy for a long time. And indeed, the book went on to be longlisted for the 2014 James Button Prize for Public Policy. James is a former army officer who commanded a cavalry troop in southern Iraq, served on the Australian Task Force headquarters in Baghdad, and was attached to Special Forces in Afghanistan. CNN's Baghdad correspondent has called James one of Australia's most insightful strategic analysts, and I think it's fair to say that James's combination of lived experience as a soldier and his scholarly insight is what makes him such a unique contributor to public debate in Australia today. James was formerly the Military Fellow at the Lowy Institute, and he now directs the Alliance 21 program at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. I should say that James just got off a plane yesterday after a long trip to America, and he's come down from Sydney just this afternoon and goes back tonight just to speak to us this evening. So a very big thank you to James.
Claire, thanks very much. No thanks for your James Brown joke. And after a month in the US, I can't tell you how many ways there are that people can introduce you. But I think it's a tribute to you and Jeff that you've pulled together such a diverse conversation tonight. We've covered so much, so it's down to me as the sort of conservative white military guy who's a vice president of an RSL to try and add something new to this conversation, which is quite a challenge. I'm going to keep it reasonably short because I think we'll want to have a good discussion. And I'm going to be a bit indulgent in what I say. I sort of was a bit intimidated by the panel like Michael, so I wanted to throw my thoughts firmly into the future, and I got a little bit carried away. I figured that was the safest ground for someone who's not a historian, not an academic, and doesn't have a journalist's eye for observation of the current either. My take on ANZAC, I guess, as Claire foreshadowed a little bit, focuses on a view that really tries to bring back the military into ANZAC and to ask what their role and what our role, what my role in all of this is, and how we connect with the military origins of this campaign. And I have a view that the excessive commemoration, I share some of the concerns mentioned today about where the commemoration we've chosen is heading and how it might become excessive and crass, where that might be occluding the role of the current military, and where it might be drowning out more serious thinking about war, the costs of war, but also the future possibility of war and how we might prepare for that, how we think about strategy, how we think about defence policy, and how we critically analyse the decisions we might make about sending men and women off to war and possibly to their death as well, which I think ultimately is what ANZAC is all about. It's about that feeling we have about what was ultimately a tragic mistake. But I thought what I might do tonight is just try and think about how we might fold some of the current conflicts, the conflicts that I and my colleagues have served in, into this ANZAC legend, into ANZAC commemoration, and then secondly, have a bit of a guess at how Australians might think about the military and war in 50 years' time. And I chose 50 years too because it's far enough out there that if I'm wrong in my predictions, I won't be able to hear your criticism anyway. But also because it's kind of it's an interesting number. I mean, I'm 34. So in 50 years' time, if I have any luck and I play my cards right, I might be one of those veterans getting interviewed by a young Chris Masters type, reflecting on what it was all about and how I feel, and potentially changing my views on everything. But to give you some context, I just wanted to let you know what my Australia of 2065 looks like. Firstly, it's a republic, and Harry Wales can come here without having to perform the pageantry of a crowded PR campaign and without us having to doff the hat to that sort of ceremony. I had Bindi Irwin as our Prime Minister. I don't know why. It just feels right. In the Australia of 2065, John Farnham is on his tour again. It's called the it's called the No Really the Last Time tour. He's got a tax bill to pay off. China has risen, it's plateaued, it's even fallen a little bit. Lockheed Martin has just put the finishing touches on the last manned fighter that the world will ever see. Australia thought it was going to be the world's biggest gas exporter, but we got a little bit lost on the way. We have sorted out our advanced manufacturing. We are building things and using smarts and exporting them to the rest of the world. We have a bigger population. And of course, Karl Stefanovic is still alive in my Australia of 2065 because anybody who's that perky in the morning can't be human and therefore can't ever die. So in this world, I'm kind of interested in thinking about how the conflicts that I served in Iraq, Afghanistan and East Timor might be folded into commemoration on the 25th of April. And I looked at this through 4 perspectives. Firstly, the people who will be taking part in this commemoration. Secondly, the places where these conflicts took place. Thirdly, the practicalities of commemorating current conflicts. And lastly, the politics of doing so. So if you think about it, my colleagues in 2065 will be getting towards the end of their lives. They'll be reflecting. They may not have diaries. They'll have thousands of photos. There'll certainly be enough for them to reflect on, and there'll certainly be enough for their family members to join that reflection. There's more than 30,000 Australians we know that have served in the Middle East alone over the last 14 years. That's a fairly big chunk of the population. It's the biggest chunk we've seen since Vietnam and Korea. When you throw in those who served in Timor, those who served in the Solomons, those who served in Iraq in 2003 during that conflict, it will be a large group. There will be a lot of Australians who still have that direct personal connection to somebody who served in their family in a war. Thinking about some of the other people who might join these commemorations is a little bit more difficult. We've seen Japanese former prisoner guards and commanders reconciling with those who fought against them in the Australian Defence Force. We've seen Turkish veterans groups, but I struggle a little bit to think about that reconciliation of ISIS supporters in 2065 and the sort of ISIS Legion getting together to bring some people out and march down the street in the Melbourne parade from the Shrine. Some of the places, I just can't imagine going back and visiting them and looking at them through a veteran's eyes. I mean, we've all seen those stories of people going back to where they fought. It's easy to do on the Western Front if you were there in World War II, to go back to the sites in Europe or even Northern Africa. It's one of the reasons why Australians go to Gallipoli, because it is such a beautiful place and it can be at the end of a European tour. But even Vietnam veterans were able to go back and tour the spots where they were based and where they fought. But for me, the idea of going back to somewhere like Tarin Kowt and walking down the streets and doing that as a tourist just seems so incredibly remote. I literally cannot put myself in that position. Baghdad, maybe. Solomon Islands, certainly. But Afghanistan particularly, the idea of being able to go back and see those places really just seems such a foreign concept. The practicalities of commemorating these conflicts in 50 years' time are somewhat curious. You need events, you need battles, and as I've made the point and others have made the point, in Afghanistan, in Iraq too, certainly in some of the operations in our part of the world, in East Timor and the Solomon Islands, most of the military achievement has resulted in nothing happening. Not a battle, not a charge, not an assault, not a storming of a beach, but a day where nothing bad happened, where a truck bomb didn't explode, where motorcyclists didn't ride up and start shooting into a crowd of civilians. So how do you commemorate that? How do you commemorate a day on which nothing happened? It's a really interesting question. How do you maintain? How do you commemorate memorials when there are already so many? We're going to have so many more memorials from this ANZAC centenary. We already have thousands across the country, but thanks to some of the programs that the federal government's implemented, we're building hundreds more. In 50 years' time, they're going to be creaking, they're going to be in need of maintenance, we're going to be trying to make decisions about, do we keep them, do we let them fall aside? I just don't think there's going to be the bandwidth to think about memorials to Iraq or to Afghanistan. And the politics of all of this. In the audience tonight, we've got Marcus Fielding, who later last year ran an excellent conference on East Timor, himself a veteran, and has written a very excellent book on his time in Baghdad. East Timor started 16 years ago, and we still don't have an official war history of that has been completed, let alone begun. We haven't begun the process of completing official war histories for Afghanistan or Iraq. It's just too raw. I think our politicians look at the UK experience with the Chillicothe inquiry into Iraq and just think, we do not want to touch that. We do not want to get into that. I hope by 2065 that we've completed those histories. But by then, certainly, they will be easier histories to complete it will be easier for us to answer the difficult questions about the politics that led us into these conflicts and to ask the questions of whether we undertook the right strategy. But right now, it's difficult to do that within the midst of the ANZAC centenary commemoration. I mentioned that I might talk about how Australians will think about military in the war, and I'll keep that very brief just to say that in 2065, I think that we will think about the possibility of war and the role of our military much more sharply. At the moment, we're lucky enough that we don't see soldiers in the street doing their job very often. We don't think about what the military does. It's not in our face. We have a blessed security environment, but I think if things continue the way they are in our part of the world, we will think more closely and more intensely about what our military does, where it does it, and how well equipped it is to do it. But also because I think the politics of defence in future decades will be much more contested. As our economy changes, as our resource base changes relative to our neighbours, we're going to have to scrutinise each and every dollar we spend in our Commonwealth budget, and that will, by necessity, sharpen our thinking about the military and war. But to take a guess at how we'll think about ANZAC, like the other panellists tonight, I think ANZAC will wax and wane. We've seen it rise, we've seen it fall, and we'll see that again. But I think those very core elements of ANZAC that make it important to Australians, and that despite all the criticisms we make of it, there is still some good at the heart of it, and there are still some sentiments that I think people believe in very seriously and strongly, that want to be part of something bigger than ourselves, that search for national cohesiveness in some kind of form, respect for service, respect for people who've endured adversity and put themselves in situations either of their own choosing or not of their own choosing. I think that will endure. So I think there will be an ANZAC Day in 2065, and I think we will mark it, and I think it will be important. But I also think that we won't have to reach so far into the past to have sympathy for struggle, and that we will have our own achievements that we can reflect on and be proud of. We will have new struggles, new achievements, and I certainly hope that by the time we get to the 25th of April in 2065, we've got the balance of this important day, not only for the past and the present, for the military, for the families, for Indigenous soldiers, for white Christian soldiers. I hope that we've certainly got the balance right when we commemorate that day 50 years from now.
Thank you, James. James, thank you for reminding us that Australia is still at war. Celeste, thank you for alerting us to the fact that female resistance warriors will never fit into the ANZAC legend. Michael, thank you for suggesting that Australians are hungry for meaning, and what that might mean. And Carolyn, thank you for letting us know that Australia is spending more money on our commemorations than any other country in the world. I certainly haven't heard that pointed out before. But I want to open this up to conversation now. I've actually received a tweet while we've been going along Michael's, the vein that Michael has been speaking in. This person has said, 150th, about 2.5 degrees warmer and unlikely to be on any beach we know now. Good point. And one person has emailed, Yuri Boyanin has emailed, I could only wish that ANZAC conversations could also involve people who are not of white or Indigenous background. Australia is not the Australia of 1850 or 1915 anymore. It will get even more diverse and multicultural with the day. Most of my friends here are Australian, but Australian from Turkish, Serbian, Chinese, Indian and Iranian background. They don't imagine society the way a left or right-wing white person or Aboriginal person does. How do they fit in this society? If Australia wants to build a vibrant, inclusive society for all, this has to go in the past. So there's another perspective as well. And I'd like to open it up for you and your perspectives.
One of the things that struck me is the question of what else there would be to say in 65 and whatever we're going to. Seems to me that an important part of what's happened lately, 10, 15 years, is that everybody's been able to attach themselves to ANZAC and to that history. So it starts with the diggers, and then it becomes their families, then it becomes women, initially as nurses and then as wives and mothers. All of these groups are being sort of commemorated. It's then extended to Indigenous people more recently. The enemy is now included, horses and dogs, gay people. In 1992, gay veterans were turned away from the shrine in Melbourne. What happened to Bruce Ruxton? I'm told that in Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra this year that they'll be invited as part of the kind of community input to lay wreaths and things. It seems to me that everybody except the people who opposed the war, and who were right, by the way, has been included. And I wondered if that's all there is to it, what could possibly happen in the next 65 years, 50 years, in terms of inclusion.
Is there one person in particular you'd like to address, or are you throwing that open to the panel? Who'd like to take that? Carolyn, go for it.
Well, the email that Claire just read out indicates that there are certain people from different cultural backgrounds who do feel that they're not included. So I guess that's one other avenue for inclusion. Christina Toomey, a historian at Monash, has wrote an article a couple of years ago that talked about the fact that ANZAC has melded itself incredibly effectively to contemporary therapy culture or trauma culture. You know, the way that we talk so readily these days about trauma and post-traumatic stress and counselling whenever a tragedy happens. So that kind of trauma culture. Well, one of the reasons that ANZAC has proved so enduring is that it's attached itself very effectively to this trauma culture. So I think what I would say about that is that we need to turn down the volume, Graham, on the whole thing. The whole thing needs to have its volume turned down. In a way, I think when I see the stuff about the Indigenous soldiers and their service being recognised, I think that's a good thing, but then I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing, Celeste, for us to then get too sort of chest-beating and jingoistic about the service of any of these people. It's one thing to recognise these people and put their voices on the historical record, but that we don't want to get too jingoistic about any element of it, do we?
I think, what I worry about is that the minute that if there's the recognition, there's the inclusion, but to what extent does that become an assimilation? So those groups are actually coming in under a banner that's just more about reinforcing that dominant narrative of war and who served it. And the people from these various groups become a best fit model rather than actually looking at all the nuances and all of the additional stories and, you know, the complexities of those sorts of involvements and how they would have unfolded. So that's what I worry about. Through inclusion, does it reinforce the dominant narrative that already exists, or are we actually expanding to tell a much broader story?
And so from an Indigenous perspective, what you're suggesting is that challenging the mythology of war should be part of the Indigenous project, but clearly a lot of Indigenous people also are wanting to graft themselves onto the ANZAC story because that also gives prominence to certain Indigenous issues. So is there a split within the Indigenous communities about that? Is that internally divisive?
It can be, because we most definitely need to have returned servicemen and women recognised. The fact that they haven't been, and it's been such a struggle to get them recognised, to me is quite despicable in Australia, and there are some unique narratives attached to that need to form part of the Australian consciousness, because their engagement was so different to anyone else's in this country. But on the other hand, we do run the risk of losing these sorts of stories about our protest, about, like I was talking, women resistance warriors or any resistance warriors. Those sorts of things may end up falling by the wayside, and to me that's actually cutting our history in half. So there needs to be some sort of way of getting all of that across and having that as part of the national narrative, as opposed to this incredibly narrow view that it seems to sit in right now.
So where do you stand personally on the issue of whether the Australian War Memorial is the right place to recognise the frontier wars? Clearly there's a big push for that. Brendan Nelson stands against that idea that the War Memorial is the place to recognise frontier wars, and I know some Indigenous people do also. They say that's not the place for it. How do you see that playing out?
I'm not entirely sure. So on one hand, I think that, it does, the frontier wars do need to be recognised. If this is part of the commemoration of those who've fallen, then this is the appropriate place to put it. But we also, to mine, we actually need to do it whilst we're also recognising Indigenous sovereignty that's never been ceded in a treaty that's never been negotiated with the First People. And so there does need to be some sort of separate recognition of the struggles that are inherent within all of those sorts of battles.
Carolyn?
Yeah, I was at the War Memorial in January, and I was looking at the new World War I galleries, and then I was walking through and looking at a recent exhibition, a recently established exhibition about contemporary wars, and I was struck by the profound difference between the type of war that the First World War was compared to the type of wars that we fight these days. I mean, that was a mass war, a huge world war. The First World War was a volunteer war, and it was basically, both world wars were groups of civilian soldiers, and I see those wars as very different in so many ways from the wars that we're fighting these days, where it's a group of highly trained professional soldiers, well-equipped, well, hopefully well-equipped and highly trained and proficient and professional. So it did strike me that perhaps there's as much of a difference between an Afghanistan or an Iraq in terms of commemorating and the First and Second World Wars, particularly the First War, as there is between those wars and in Indigenous wars.
James, do you have a comment on that, given that...
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a really important point, the split between professional and amateur. I mean, it would be very hard to sort of make the case that I was pressed to go to Iraq or Afghanistan against my will. It's something I wanted to do. I was a professional soldier. I had a whole range of motivations for wanting to be there, as did the guys I went with. So it's a very different story. It's not as the story of rising to a challenge unexpectedly, perhaps against your will, is a very different one from sort of, I suppose, quite calculatingly choosing a career and following it overseas. It's a very different, much less romantic notion, I suppose.
Okay, what do you do this Saturday in 50 years' time if you really believe that the whole First World War was a horrible monstrosity, a war between monarchs, and as Archbishop Mannix once said here in Melbourne, a trade war, and Paul Keating more recently said a war of no redeeming value? What do you do this Saturday in 50 years' time? And my hope is we should forget the whole horrible Gallipoli campaign, First World War, as soon as possible.
Michael, do you want to take that one on?
I don't think you deny your history. I mean, we'll still have to commemorate it in some way, I think. I think the broader question is, how much does the ANZAC story become about Australia, and how much does it become just about the ANZAC story and the First World War? Because at the moment, we're investing in it so much about what it is to be Australian, and that's what's attracting a lot of people as well to the commemorations, is that it's sort of a nationalism and a patriotism about, which has sort of invested it with a completely different meaning, certainly from my grandparents and a lot of people of that generation. So look, in 2065, you can still, I'm sure, hopefully, you'll still be able to, stand up there with your placards and say, war's a bad thing. I don't think that's going to be a problem. But to suggest that, we can somehow deny or not commemorate it, I think is wrong. It will always be commemorated. I think the discussion we're having now is, what is the meaning? Why are we, why do we invest this day with what we are investing in it, particularly this year? Because, as we've seen, the Coles campaigns, the Woolies campaigns, and all this sort of stuff, it all gets mixed up into this weird sense of identity that people sort of attach all of these other things onto.
But you say there that it's not a problem to get up and suggest that war is a bad thing, but actually what we're finding very much that it is, that people who do want to say that war is a bad thing, this goes to
I think that at the
original...
moment, yes, that's true. I think perhaps in 50 years' time, with any luck, I mean, that might be different, and we may have returned to ANZAC Day actually being more about the First World War, the horrors of it, the campaign, and what it meant, but not necessarily investing it with this sort of total sense of national identity.
Good evening. My name's Marcus Fielding. I'm a veteran and I served for 30 odd years, and in 50 years' time I'll be dead, but James will still be marching, which is terrific.
Rolling.
There's one stakeholder group that really gets marginalised in this whole debate and discussion, and they're the veterans themselves. We don't get a say in this. We're buffeted between politics, commercialisation, anti-war people, and we're just stuck in the middle at the moment. And I speak for hundreds of thousands of us. We are of the view, in general terms, that it's a day for quiet reflection. We've been through some of the things that everyone's talking about. So it's interesting that we're the group that's not being included in most of this, and it's quite disturbing because I know for a number of years now I've been trying to organise for contemporary veterans to march on ANZAC Day, and they're just not doing it. And you talk about a backlash, well, it's already had an effect because the contemporary veterans, are just not buying into this anymore. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'd be interested to see what your reaction is because, the people that are the main subject of this seem to be being increasingly marginalised in the whole process. And just to pick up on James's point, there's a lot of people that have served in the military. The numbers are about 25,000 for Iraq, about 35,000 for Afghanistan. But they're the silent majority at the moment. Well, they're a silent group. There's only a couple of us that actually speak in public. The vast majority of them just go to ground.
Are you suggesting that they are actively silenced or that they themselves do not want to come
they're
forward?
They're self-silencing. So I'd just be interested in your perspective on that. And James, perhaps you'd like to lead off.
Well, look, I'm absolutely simpatico on that. I think veterans are sort of hiding in plain sight when it comes to ANZAC and all that it involves. Prevented in a lot of cases from speaking. I found out last week that it's now illegal for serving defence personnel to post an image of themselves on any social media platform in uniform. Now, there are some security reasons why you might have concerns about that, but it's kind of a crazy blanket policy in a year in which, everyone in Australia is posting images of people in uniform. You cannot post, people cannot post images of their own service. It seems very strange. It's just one of the small ways in which veterans of modern conflicts and serving personnel have been a bit crowded out of this conversation. The other reason is that we haven't been very good at talking about recent wars and connecting the military. But to zero in on even more on a group within the military who sort of get left out of all of this, and that's female veterans, who now make up, in some cases, up to 14% of the contingents that serve in different conflicts, and have a really hard time, plugging into return service organisations who don't see themselves reflected in a lot of these stories. You walk into the offices of the Department of Veterans Affairs here in Melbourne, who are very good and do a good job, but have their own legacy. Last time I went in, there wasn't a single image of a female soldier on the wall. So here is a group you would think fit right into this ANZAC narrative, who are not left out or marginalised in the way that Indigenous Australians are, or people who don't want to have anything, or who don't support sort of military efforts or anything like that, and they're left out of it as well. It's kind of interesting.
And are they voicing their dissatisfaction about that, or similarly are they going to ground? Is it safer to be quiet?
It's hard to generalise. I haven't seen a lot of voicing of dissatisfaction. I've seen a few people there's been a couple of really interesting studies looking at how female veterans feel about all of this and what their specific issues are when it comes to rehabilitation and reintegration, but it's still pretty isolated.
My question's for Caroline and James mainly. It's comparing ANZAC Day to Remembrance Day. As I grew up, Remembrance Day was more about the end of the war. It seemed to be more neutral and an international day, and now it seems to be in the shadow. So I'm just curious, historically, was that always the way? How did the 2 days compare against each other? And how do you see that moving forward? Will Remembrance Day be kind of forgotten and ANZAC Day be the only day that we commemorate?
Thank you. I think it has always been the case that there's been a difference between ANZAC commemoration and Remembrance Day. Someone made a comparison that ANZAC Day was like Christmas Day, whereas Remembrance Day was more like Easter Sunday. Remembrance Day always seems to have been more solemn. And ANZAC Day has always had attached to it that element of celebration and pride and nationalism, Australian nationalism. That's the day where we talk about the birth of the Australian nation. So if you look at how other countries commemorate the First World War, Remembrance Day, people tend to focus on Remembrance Day, and it's a day of solemn remembrance. It emphasises tragedy and suffering. But ANZAC Day is unique to Australia and New Zealand, and the way that we celebrate it in Australia is unique. The New Zealanders, it's getting bigger in New Zealand, I believe, but it's not as big as it is in Australia. And that's because in Australia it is linked with the idea of the birth of the Australian nation. So it's got this whole sort of nationalist component to it that Remembrance Day doesn't have.
A few of us have talked about wanting ANZAC Day to be more muted. I mean, if you want to see a commemoration now that is as muted as it possibly can be, that's the 11th of November. It really has faded a lot into the background. I think the other thing that's worth noting too is that the commemorative calendar is now pretty crowded. Beyond ANZAC Day, beyond Remembrance Day, there are a whole host of other events. I mean, I used to work around the corner from the Cenotaph in Sydney's Martin Place, and you can see a commemoration event there almost every fortnight. It's the Battle of the Coral Sea, we now have a day of national significance, the Battle for Australia, referring to the attacks that took place in Darwin. So there is a lot of commemorative activity, but the one that really rises above is the 25th of April.
Interestingly, Remembrance Day does have that international significance. As you say, it is celebrated in other places in the world. Michael, do you have an international perspective on that? In all the countries that you've lived in, has Remembrance Day, does it strike a chord?
Actually, the Russians probably have a much more crowded commemorative process. I mean, it seemed to me, when we were there, it was almost every second day there was fireworks going off for something, so they take it all very seriously. But also, they had, I mean, if you look at places like Russia where they lost, in the Second World War, was it 20 million people or something? I mean, the impact, the impact for us in the Great War, in the First War, was very significant, but the impact of those other conflicts in Europe were horrendous. And Remembrance Day just has so much. It has so much meaning there. I mean, and again now, I mean, in the battlefields of France and Belgium, the Menin Gate ceremony is very important. But interestingly, ANZAC Day is becoming a huge thing. In Ypres as well. A lot of Australians go there, and that dawn service which they have, I think they have that every day, don't they, the Menin Gate? But the one on the 25th of April is just has become, quite huge. So, look, yeah, I think the interesting thing about, I think, just to reflect on what was being said about the way the military sees this, and I started to notice this when I became the defence correspondent and started writing about ANZAC Day, and the number of military people who'd contact me and say, well, yes, you're saying the sorts of things that we've been feeling for ages, and when I went to Taron Cott, when Tony Abbott sort of did this, didn't actually lower the flag, but it was the final thing. One of the big military leaders, Australians, came up to me and said, no one knows about this war. No one has been told about this war. And I said, well, it's not for want of trying, because the Australian military just does not give people access to tell the stories that Australian soldiers want to be told a lot of the time. And so, there's this sort of dance going on, which I don't think is serving anybody particularly well, and it's because, I don't know why, but they're just afraid that the Australian military experience is not all good, but it's not all bad either. So, but you have to open it up, you have to let people see it, and you have to let it be reported for people to get a look at it.
Hello, I'm Margaret Beavis. I'm with the Medical Association for Prevention of War. I had a question, particularly starting with James. With ANZAC Day, a lot of people are getting very involved in ANZAC Day. They have family members or reasons to identify with that ANZAC Day. And to what extent is that impairing people's ability to think critically about war? The fact that they're identifying with something that's important to them, to what extent does that alter our ability to critically analyse the conflicts we may have in future or are involved in at present?
Thanks, Margaret. It's a great question. I suppose there's two issues in that. One is, what's the sort of balance between the head and the heart when it comes to thinking about war, and then the second question is, or the second part of your question is, how do you, what does the personal connection mean? Let me hit the second bit. I mean, I think there increasingly genealogy is mixed up with ANZAC commemoration. So partly it's about national service and respect and sort of military service and military history and national narrative and all that kind of thing. But also it's just a really good way to connect with your ancestors. And sometimes the only sort of bits of memorabilia that people have from their ancestors are the military bits and pieces and the service records and that kind of thing. So I think that is playing an increasingly big part of it. It's probably a little bit controversial, but if it was up to me, I probably wouldn't let descendants of veterans march in the same ranks as veterans on ANZAC Day, because I just think that is not appropriate. You're recognising people who've put their life on the line, and being the descendant of a veteran is important, but you shouldn't have equal status to veterans who've been to war. But that's a bit of a digression. Your question about how much of this should be about head and how much of this should be about heart, I think is a good one. I would like people to more critically engage with thinking about war, and I know your organisation does that. But people are only going to do that if they care, if they're motivated. And one of the challenges, it's a great challenge to have, is that in a country that's relatively unscathed by war, that has very few security problems, our bandwidth to actually think about this stuff is 24 hours, if not 1 minute. And at the moment, I probably share your concerns that the balance is far too much towards sentiment, which at best is heartfelt, but at worst is sort of drippy and calorific, rather than sort of more serious contemplation.
Just following on from that question, to what extent do you think that this overemphasis on the sentiment around ANZAC Day potentially crowds out serious discussion of other issues, whether they be issues around our current defence alliance, relationship with the United States, and also what's the connection, and I'm particularly looking at you, James, but thanks to all the other panellists as well, and for anybody who wanted to talk about this, to what extent does the relationship between politicians who might seek to extract political capital from the current attention on ANZAC Day, the relationship between a military which always wants to maximise its access to resources, noting that, for example, a former defence chief and now our current Governor-General, if I'm not mistaken, raised a glass on more than one occasion, I think, for ANZAC Day, didn't he?
Yeah, well, look, just briefly on the last part of your question, the relationship between parliamentarians and the military is a really interesting one. I do have a sense that a lot of parliamentarians are a little bit too enamoured of the uniform and don't ask tough enough questions, or when they do ask tough questions, don't always ask them in the most constructive way. And a great example of that is this thing called the Australian Defence Force Parliamentary Program. So back in 2000, the Defence Force quite rightly identified that a lot of parliamentarians had zero experience with the military, which made it very hard for them to exercise oversight or engage or understand their needs. So they set up this kind of work experience program where parliamentarians would go off with a military unit for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, and then defence people would go into the parliament and work in their office for a couple of days and a couple of weeks. And you see the reports that come back from these placements, and they're very simplistic and they're very glowing, and it's sort of empathy rather than critical analysis of. So yeah, I think there's a lot of scope for parliamentarians to take a more rigorous view, but it's also very hard for them to do for the reasons that Michael's outlined about the level of information that comes from defence. It's just a very bewildering area of policy to get to grips with as well, because you're covering, defence has everything from hospitals to logistics to international relations to, the intelligence stuff and all the traditional issues.
It's often seen as almost un-Australian to question the defence too by politicians. Like there's an expectation that you will, among most of them particularly, that you will support what our defence forces do without really questioning too hard, because it's not perceived to be popular to do so, or whatever.
There's also a bit of a funny loop. I mean, I'm sure if you peered into any politician's calendar for the next 7 days, they will be going to so many commemorative activities that even if you were the greatest ANZAC enthusiast, I think it would start to wear a little bit thin. So there's this sort of cycle of, you do it because you want to, but also because it's expected, and who's actually setting the expectations.
I want to thank our panel, firstly, James Brown, Celeste Liddle, Michael Brissenden and Carolyn Holbrook, for their time and their thoughts tonight.